I never thought something as simple as a van could mean so much. But when your child can't walk on his own, when he relies on a wheelchair every single day of his life, that van becomes more than just a vehicle. It becomes his legs, his freedom, his connection to the world outside our home. My son Ethan is 11 years old. He was born with a rare neuromuscular disorder that's left him unable to walk. The first few years were a blur of doctors, therapists, and hospitals. And through it all, he never stopped smiling. He laughs at the smallest things, like when our golden retriever Max tries to catch soap bubbles in the yard, or when I make his favorite pancakes in the shape of dinosaurs. Ethan doesn't complain. Not when the kids at school stare. Not when he has to be hoisted into his chair. Not when he sees other boys riding bikes and playing tag, knowing he never will. That's just the kind of kid he is. Stronger than most grown men I know. So, when we finally saved enough to buy an accessible van, one with a built-in ramp and enough space to secure his wheelchair safely, it felt like we'd just bought him the world. We'd been borrowing a neighbor's modified vehicle for months, and every trip had to be planned days in advance. But now, with our own van in the driveway, I could finally take him to therapy without juggling rides. We could go on impromptu ice cream runs. We could visit his grandparents on the other side of town. It was freedom, for both of us. The first week we had it, Ethan asked to go to the park every afternoon. The van gave him that. He'd grin as I wheeled him down the ramp and onto the sidewalk, his little fists pumping the air like he was a superhero making a grand entrance. And then, just days later, the letter came, a plain white envelope. No warning, no knock on the door, just a cold, impersonal notice from the HOA stuffed into our mailbox. Notice of non-compliant vehicle, accessible van violation. I read it 3 times, hoping I'd misunderstood. But the message was clear. Our van was too large, aesthetically, inconsistent with neighborhood standards, and disruptive to community appearance. In other words, the HOA thought it was ugly. I felt my stomach drop. They didn't mention the ramp, or the medical necessity. Just that it was unsightly, and needed to be moved out of view, preferably into our garage or off-site altogether. Our garage? It barely fits our sedan. There's no way that van, with the lift and the ramp, could possibly squeeze in there. And off-site? What, were we supposed to park it miles away and carry Ethan to it? I walked into Ethan's room and just stared at him while he colored pictures of rocket ships. How do you tell your child that the neighborhood you live in, the one you pay dues to, the one with the manicured lawns and smiling neighbors, doesn't think his wheelchair van belongs here? That they'd rather hide it away like it's something shameful? I didn't have the heart to tell him. Not that day. That night, I sat in the dark with the notice in my hand and rage boiling in my chest. But beneath the anger was something worse. Pain, a deep, hollow ache that this was how the world saw my son. Not as a sweet, brilliant, resilient little boy, but as a burden, an inconvenience, an eyesore. We didn't ask for pity. We didn't ask for special treatment. All we wanted was to live, to give Ethan as normal a life as possible. The van wasn't some luxury. It was survival, and they wanted it gone. The next morning, I called the HOA. I kept my voice steady, even though my hands were shaking. I explained the situation. I told them about Ethan, about his condition, about the ramp and why the van was necessary. The woman on the phone didn't care. She spoke in rehearsed, clipped sentences like she was reading from a script. "The board has already made its determination," she said. "We understand your concerns, but rules are rules." Rules. What kind of rule punishes a child for needing mobility? Later that day, I received an email saying we had 10 days to resolve the violation or face daily fines. I broke down that night. I sat in the laundry room so Ethan wouldn't hear, and I cried until I couldn't breathe. I cried for my son, for all the things he already had to face, and now this petty, heartless war over a van. It didn't make sense. How could people be so cruel? So blind to the impact of their decisions? But I wasn't going to let this break us. I wiped my face, stood up, and made a promise to myself. If they thought they could bully my family into hiding, they were dead wrong. They wanted a fight? Fine. I'd give them one they'd never forget. The word eyesore echoed in my head like a bad dream. I kept rereading the section of the HOA violation notice that said it: cold, clinical, and cruel. The oversized van is considered an aesthetic disruption to the uniform appearance of the neighborhood and may be perceived as an eyesore by fellow residents. Not a necessary vehicle, not an accessible mobility aid. An eyesore. I looked out the window at the van sitting in our driveway. Clean, well-maintained, parked neatly just like every other car on the street. The only difference? Ours had a ramp and a little blue handicap placard hanging from the rearview mirror. That was enough for the HOA to decide we were bringing down their precious community aesthetic. I wondered if they knew what it took to even get that van. For over a year, my wife and I pinched every penny. We sold our second car, canceled vacations, skipped birthdays, and worked late hours just to afford that modified van. Insurance covered part of the conversion cost, but not all of it. The ramp alone was over $6,000, but it was worth every dollar. That van gave Ethan the ability to leave the house with dignity, not being lifted in and out like a sack of potatoes. He could wheel himself right in, his chair locking into place beside me as we drove to school or therapy or the zoo. And now, some board of concerned neighbors had decided it didn't belong here. I wanted to scream. But instead, I did what I thought was the adult thing to do. I asked for a meeting. The HOA was holding their next board meeting in 3 days. It was open to residents, and I RSVP'd that very night. I wasn't going to let this be some faceless exchange of cold letters. If they wanted to pretend my son's life was a nuisance, they were going to have to look me in the eye and say it. In the meantime, the neighborhood gossip machine started churning. We live in one of those Stepford-type subdivisions where people wave at you from driveways and post passive-aggressive comments in the neighborhood Facebook group. At first, I tried to keep things private, but news travels fast, especially when someone's seen loading a wheelchair into a van that's suddenly being threatened with removal. Some neighbors reached out to offer support. A sweet elderly couple across the street baked us cookies and said they'd sign anything we needed, but others weren't so kind. One afternoon, while helping Ethan get into the van, a man from 2 houses down walked by and said, "Not to be rude, but have you ever considered parking that thing somewhere else? It kind of sticks out." Kind of sticks out. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Not because I didn't have something to say, but because I was afraid of what I might say. Instead, I hugged Ethan tighter, kissed the top of his head, and promised myself again they weren't going to win. The day of the board meeting came, and I showed up early. I wore my best button-down shirt and brought a folder full of documents, medical records, photos, disability accommodation laws. But more than anything, I brought Ethan. He sat beside me in his chair, wearing his school uniform and his favorite Pokemon cap. He was confused about why we were going to a grown-up meeting, but I just told him it was to help people understand something important. When our turn came to speak, I stood up and looked around the room. 5 HOA board members sat behind a long folding table, sipping from styrofoam cups. They barely looked up when I began. "I'm here about the violation notice regarding our accessible van," I started. "My son Ethan uses a wheelchair. This van is how we get him to school, therapy, and doctor appointments. Without it, we're stuck." One woman adjusted her glasses. Another man coughed into his hand. I continued. "We didn't buy this van to be flashy. We bought it because it's necessary. And while it may not match the aesthetic you're aiming for, it represents independence, dignity, and care." I paused, then motioned toward Ethan. "This is my son. He's 11 years old, and all he wants is the chance to live a life like other kids. That van is his lifeline. Calling it an eyesore is not just insensitive, it's inhumane." For the first time, one of the board members looked directly at Ethan. There was silence. And then, from the end of the table, the board president cleared his throat. "We understand your situation, Mr. Walker," he said, voice dry and dismissive. "But the vehicle violates Section 4.3 of the HOA parking guidelines. Exceptions would set a precedent that could undermine the uniformity of the community." I blinked. "So, let me get this straight. You're saying that a rule in a binder is more important than a child's mobility?" He didn't answer. Ethan looked up at me and whispered, "Dad, did we do something wrong?" That broke me. I turned back to the board, hands trembling. "You should be ashamed. You're not protecting this community. You're policing it. And if you think I'm going to quietly roll over while you treat my son like a problem, you're mistaken. I gathered our things and wheeled Ethan out of that room without another word. But my mind was already racing. If this board thought they could hide behind rules and fine print, they didn't know who they were dealing with. Because I wasn't just a dad anymore, I was a storm, and I was done being polite. Something in me shifted after that first board meeting. I left that room shaking, part anger, part disbelief, part heartbreak, but mostly just fired up. I'd been polite. I'd come with facts, reason, and the most human face I could present. My sons. And still, they brushed us off like we were some inconvenience on a checklist. That was their mistake. They thought I was just another frustrated resident. But they didn't realize who they were messing with. A father with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The day after the meeting, I did something I hadn't done since college. I pulled an all-nighter, researching fair housing, laws, ADA regulations, legal precedents involving HOAs and accessibility, even case law from states where boards had tried to enforce aesthetic rules over mobility aids. I joined forums, reached out to disability rights advocates, even messaged a local news reporter I knew covered HOA disputes. I wasn't just going to win this fight. I was going to make them wish they had never written that notice. But I knew, just being right wasn't enough. They had power, and power protects itself. So I needed to bring something they couldn't ignore. Pressure. From the community. From the public. From the law. First, I took to our neighborhood Facebook group, posted a picture of Ethan smiling from his wheelchair inside the van, and then I wrote a long, heartfelt message. This is my son. His name is Ethan. He loves dinosaurs, outer space, and anything with syrup on it. What he doesn't love is being treated like he doesn't belong. The HOA thinks the accessible van we use to take him to school and therapy is an eyesore and wants us to remove it from our own driveway. They've threatened us with fines. They've ignored our pleas for compassion. All because his needs don't match their definition of uniformity. If you think this is wrong, if you believe a child's right to move freely is more important than neighborhood aesthetics, say something. Because if they can do this to us, they can do it to anyone. I hit post and waited. Within an hour, the comment section exploded. This is disgusting. How can they do this? We're with you. Where do we sign? You tell me who voted for these clowns. I'll run against them myself. They're messing with a disabled kid? Are you kidding me? Some neighbors who'd previously stayed silent now reached out to apologize. Others offered to speak on our behalf. And then came the local news station. The same reporter I'd messaged responded. He wanted to do a segment. Said it was exactly the kind of human story people needed to hear. So, a week later, I stood in front of our van with Ethan in my arms, facing a camera crew. I told our story again. This time for the world to hear. I kept my voice steady, but I didn't hide the emotion. The van isn't ugly, I said. What's ugly is an HOA board that thinks a child's mobility is a nuisance. By the time the story aired, it had been shared over 50,000 times on social media. And that's when everything changed. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following week, and I planned to be there. Not alone this time, but with backup. I reached out to every neighbor who commented support, invited friends from Ethan's school, even asked one of his therapists to come speak. The night of the meeting, the room was packed. Standing room only. Some people even stood outside the windows, listening through the glass. The board looked rattled. Gone were the smug expressions and clipped responses from before. Now they looked like deer in headlights, nervous, whispering among themselves as people filed in and took their seats. I stood up, holding a folder in one hand, my other hand resting on Ethan's shoulder. I came here 2 weeks ago to ask you to do the right thing, I began. You didn't listen. So now I've brought the community you're supposed to represent, because they deserve to know how you treat the people you serve. A murmur of agreement swept through the room. You called our van an eyesore. But let's be clear. You weren't talking about metal and wheels. You were talking about him. I gestured to Ethan, who looked up at me with those wide, trusting eyes. You tried to make us feel like outsiders in our own home. You tried to hide us away because we didn't fit your picture-perfect idea of what this neighborhood should look like. I held up a printed copy of the Fair Housing Act, flipping to the section on reasonable accommodations. Well, here's what the law says. You are required, by federal law, to make accommodations for people with disabilities. That means not penalizing them for mobility aids. That means not punishing them for needing access. And that definitely means not calling the tools that give them freedom a violation of your so-called standards. The room erupted into applause. Several people stood up and shouted, "Tell 'em!" And that's right. The board president tried to respond, voice shaky. We never meant to cause harm. The rule is in place to ensure harmony within the neighborhood. I cut in. Harmony? You call this harmony? I swept my hand across the packed room. You've created division, not harmony. And you've put a target on a child's back in the name of property value. Another voice from the back piped up. A retired veteran who lived 3 houses down. You go after a disabled kid's van. You go after all of us. This ain't the community I signed up for. More applause. Some people were in tears. I looked the board dead in the eyes. You have 2 choices. Rescind the violation, issue a public apology, or prepare for a federal lawsuit and the full weight of this community calling for your resignation. The board sat in stunned silence. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt hope rise in my chest. I'd come into this room alone 2 weeks ago, my voice shaking, trying to convince people to see us. Now, I was backed by a crowd. And they finally did. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and join our community. Your support means the world to us. And if you've ever faced an unfair situation like this, or have a story you'd like to share, drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your story and stand together in the fight for fairness. I thought the board would fold after that meeting. I thought maybe, just maybe, seeing a crowd of angry neighbors and hearing the law read out loud would make them realize they were on the wrong side of this. But I underestimated one thing. Pride. The kind of pride that doesn't just ignore common sense, it runs from it. The kind that refuses to back down not because it's right, but because it can't stand to be proven wrong. 2 days after the meeting, I got another notice in the mail. This one was worse, more formal, more aggressive. The HOA was doubling down, stating that while they sympathized with our family's situation, they were within their rights to enforce community standards, and that failure to relocate the van within 14 days would result in daily fines, $150 a day. They even threw in a veiled threat that continued noncompliance could result in legal action or a lien on the property. I sat on the kitchen floor reading that letter while Ethan played in the living room. I felt my chest tighten. My wife crouched down beside me, reading the paper over my shoulder. Neither of us said anything at first. Then she whispered, "We can't let them win." And we wouldn't. But this time, we weren't just going to fight back. We were going to blow this up. The first thing I did was call the reporter who had run our initial story. I told him about the new notice, the fines, the threat of legal action. His response? "I'm on my way." The follow-up story aired that evening. HOA retaliates against family with disabled son after community pushback. It showed the letter. It showed Ethan. It showed me standing in our driveway holding up the notice with disbelief in my eyes. The segment ended with a line that sent shivers down my spine. If this is what protecting neighborhood aesthetics looks like, what are we really saying about who belongs in our communities? The fallout was instant. Support came pouring in from every direction. Messages from strangers, local businesses offering help. A nearby law firm reached out and offered pro bono legal support. Disability rights organizations started tagging our HOA online, calling their actions a textbook case of discrimination. Our story hit national news within 48 hours. One of the headlines read, "Family of disabled child targeted by HOA for accessible van, America outraged." I received a call from a woman in Chicago whose son was also in a wheelchair. She cried, on the phone, saying she'd been dealing with the same discrimination for years. "You're doing this for all of us," she said. "Don't stop." That's when I knew this wasn't just about my family anymore. So we went louder. I created a social media campaign called See the Van, See the Boy. The idea was simple. When people saw our van, they weren't supposed to see a violation. They were supposed to see Ethan, his courage, his needs, his life. We posted photos of Ethan inside the van, laughing, reading, watching clouds from the passenger side. We shared stories of our daily life. The morning struggles to get out the door, the ramp malfunctions, the time the van broke down and Ethan cried because he missed his therapy session. The internet fell in love with him. Ethan, unaware of the digital firestorm he was at the center of, just kept asking why people were being so nice. Why someone mailed him a stuffed Pikachu with a note that said, "Keep smiling, champ." One day, a group of kids from Ethan's school made signs and stood at the entrance to our neighborhood with them. Accessibility is not an eyesore. Shoei, handicaps over aesthetics. Let Ethan ride. Drivers honked. People slowed, down to wave. Someone dropped off pizza for the kids with a note that said, "Keep standing up." Meanwhile, the HOA board was crumbling from the inside. I started getting calls from other residents telling me that 2 of the board members had resigned under pressure. Another was reportedly being investigated for misusing funds unrelated to our situation. And the board president, the one who first signed that violation notice, was caught on camera yelling at a news crew outside his house. It was over for them, but I still wanted it to end the right way. I filed a formal legal complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, citing violations of the Fair Housing Act. The attorney representing us submitted copies of all HOA correspondence, the fines, the footage of the board meetings. Within a week, HUD opened an investigation, and finally, the letter came. The HOA board hereby withdraws all violation notices against the Walker family and formally apologizes for any distress or harm caused. We will also be reviewing and updating our community guidelines to ensure future ADA compliance. It was a win, but it didn't feel like a celebration, because I kept thinking about what would have happened if we hadn't had the time, the energy, the voice to fight back. What about the families who didn't go viral? The ones who quietly sold their homes because the rules made their lives impossible? What about all the kids like Ethan, whose needs were considered too inconvenient to be accepted? I walked outside, folded the letter into my back pocket, and sat in the van with Ethan. He looked up at me with that goofy grin of his, holding a juice box, totally unaware that the world had just changed for him. "Did we win, Dad?" he asked. He swallowed the lump in my throat. "Yeah, buddy," I said. "We did." The air felt different after the apology letter arrived. It wasn't just relief. It was something deeper. I had spent so many nights questioning whether I was doing the right thing by pushing so hard, by turning our private struggle into a public war. But now, watching my son roll confidently into his van without anyone trying to hide him, I knew it had all been worth it. The very next morning, Ethan's school had something waiting for him. A giant banner over the entrance gate that read, "We love your van, Ethan." He beamed like he was walking into Disney World. That moment broke something, open in me, something I didn't know I'd been holding together this whole time. I stepped back, sat on the curb by the school parking lot, and cried for the first time in weeks. But these tears weren't from rage or grief. They were from pride. My little boy didn't know the legal codes or the HOA bylaws or the way grown adults had tried to erase him from view. He just knew people were smiling at him again, waving, talking about his favorite shows and how cool his van was, and suddenly, the thing we had been punished for became the thing people celebrated. Not long after, a national morning show reached out. They wanted to fly us to New York. "America needs to meet Ethan," they said. We were hesitant at first. He gets overwhelmed by new places. But when I told him the news, he jumped up and shouted, "Do they have pancakes?" We flew out 2 weeks later. They paid for everything. When we landed, they had a wheelchair-accessible car waiting at the airport with a driver who greeted Ethan by name. He giggled the whole ride, staring out the window at skyscrapers he'd only seen in books. On the day of the interview, he wore his favorite shirt, blue, with a big yellow T-Rex, and brought his stuffed Pikachu for comfort. We sat on the studio couch, and the host asked, "So, tell us, what does this van mean to your family?" I looked at Ethan, who was gripping my hand tightly, and I said, "To some people, it's just a van, maybe a big one, maybe different looking. But to us, it's freedom. It's how Ethan goes to school, how he gets to the park, how he goes to therapy. It's the only way we can live life outside these four walls without being afraid of steps or sidewalks or curbs. So when the HOA told us our van didn't belong, they were telling us he didn't belong. But the truth is, this van isn't a violation. It's a victory. The studio went quiet. The host looked like she was fighting back tears. Then she leaned down to Ethan and asked, "What's your favorite thing about your van?" Ethan thought for a second, then smiled. "It smells like waffles," he said. The audience lost it. Clapping, laughing, some crying. That one line ended up becoming a meme. "Smells like waffles" started trending on social media as a symbol of disabled pride and family resilience. A week later, the van company we'd bought from sent us a thank you letter and a check to cover a full upgrade. Top-tier accessible equipment, better seating, even a fold-out TV screen in the back so Ethan could watch movies on long drives. But the part that hit hardest? Letters. Dozens, then hundreds. From all over the country. Parents who'd been fined or threatened for installing ramps. Veterans who felt ashamed to ask for accommodations. Grandparents who'd moved away from HOA neighborhoods just to feel welcome again. One letter from a single mother in Nevada read, "I watched your story with my son. He has CP and uses a chair too. We cried the whole time. Thank you for fighting when I was too scared to." That letter now hangs framed in our hallway. And then, out of nowhere, came a message I never expected. It was from a former member of our HOA board. The same one who had sat silently while we pleaded at the first meeting. Her message was short, but I could feel the weight behind it. I was wrong. I didn't speak up when I should have. I hope you'll forgive me, and I hope you never stop using that van. That meant more to me than I can explain, because it reminded me that people can change, that hearts can soften, that even in the face of cruelty or cowardice, there is always room for growth. So what does life look like now? The fines are gone. The threats are over. The van still sits proudly in our driveway, cleaner than ever, with a custom plate that reads Freethen. The HOA board has been almost completely replaced. New people ran. People who get it. People who stood beside us, not behind their rules. Ethan has become a little local celebrity. People wave at him on the sidewalk. Kids ask to ride in the van just to see the cool ramp go down. He started calling it the Ethan Express. And every so often, when I'm parked in the driveway, I catch someone slowing down as they pass. Our house. They're not staring in judgment anymore. They're stopping in solidarity. A few weeks ago, we had a block party, something our neighborhood hadn't done in years. Ethan was there, of course. Center stage, music playing, smiling from ear to ear. And when someone handed him a microphone and asked if he wanted to say anything, he stood up in his chair and shouted, "My van is awesome!" Everyone cheered, and I stood there surrounded by people holding my wife's hand and blinking back tears, realizing just how far we'd come. This fight started with a violation notice, but it ended with something so much bigger. It ended with visibility, with dignity, with a neighborhood, and maybe even a country, learning that accessibility isn't optional, it's essential. And no child should ever be made to feel like their needs are too inconvenient to be seen. So yes, they tried to ban our son's van, but what they really did was put a spotlight on him, and now the whole world knows exactly who he is.